I've heard some outrageous hotels in my day. A power-hungry board members obsessed with mailbox colors, heated debates over grass height, the whole absurd spectrum. But what happened to me, it tops them all. It might actually qualify as the most ridiculous case of HOA overreach and pure ignorance ever recorded. They claimed my lake had a serene, spring-fed lake that was the main reason I bought my land. It was a flooding hazard, a hazard. That peaceful, steady body of water that had sat undisturbed for generations was suddenly considered a threat. And their solution? They drained it completely, turned it into a muddy, heartbreaking wasteland. And just when I thought it couldn't get worse, they paved over it. That sacred patch of earth became a black, scorching parking lot, striped and soulless, my private paradise erased. Also, they could cram in more oversized gas-guzzling SUVs. But they made one huge misstep. They chose the wrong person to mess with. I'm Arthur Jenkins, a civil engineer with a focus on hydrology and the science of water, how it moves, where it goes, and what it does. And believe me when I say this, water always finds a way. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from, because you won't believe how this unfolded. It began around 10 years ago when I discovered a perfect little haven at the edge of a freshly minted, fast-growing suburban neighborhood called Willow Creek Estates. The name was almost laughable considering the developers had buried most of the actual creeks to squeeze in more homes. But my land was different. A 5-acre lot bordering the neighborhood on just one side, with the remaining edges surrounded by untouched forest. The crown jewel, a gorgeous 2-acre lake, not massive, but deep, clear, and alive, filled with bass, bluegill, and even the occasional heron. Towering oaks and maples circled it, their limbs brushing the surface of the water. This place was my escape. On summer days, I'd dive in for a swim, drift around in a rowboat with a fishing pole, or just sit at the edge of the dock I built myself, watching the sky melt into the water in shades of orange and purple. The old man who owned the land before me had lived there for 50 years. He told me the lake had been part of the land for as long as anyone could remember, a natural basin collecting spring water and rain, gradually seeping into the soil and trickling toward a distant creek. It was, in hydrological terms, a flawless natural retention and detention system. For the first few years, I simply enjoyed it. I took care of the property and minded my own business. I knew Willow Creek Estates had an HOA, but since my parcel wasn't technically included in their original development plan, and I had zero interest in their sterile clubhouse or chlorinated pools, I ignored them. Looking back, that was a bit naive. It all started slowly at a kind of quiet escalation you don't notice until it's too late. The catalyst was a man named Gerald Henderson, the HOA president. His sense of authority was only outmatched by his inflated ego. Late 50s, always in tight golf shirts, his face constantly flushed like he was either furious or just perpetually offended by life itself. He drove a pristine white Escalade, one that had probably never encountered a dirt road, and seemed to believe the entire neighborhood was his personal kingdom. Our first clash came through an official-sounding letter complaining about the unsightly milkweed growing along my fence, which happened to border one of their common areas. That milkweed, mind you, was part of a small butterfly habitat I was cultivating for monarchs. I sent back a kind explanation, assuming reason might prevail. But Henderson didn't care about ecosystems unless they were mowed in uniform lines and doused in pesticides. He huffed, he puffed, probably ranted about property values. But since the fence was on my land and the milkweed wasn't considered a nuisance by county standards, he couldn't actually do anything. Still, I could tell he'd marked me as a problem, or rather, a challenge he intended to overcome. Over the following year, the petty harassment continued. I received complaints about frog noises coming from my lake, frogs, in a place named Willow Creek. Then came a warning about my compost bin. Even though it sat more than 100 feet from any HOA property line, each time, I checked county laws, confirmed I was within my rights, and sent a firm but polite response. And each time, Henderson's irritation visibly grew. He clearly wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone who knew how to push back. Then, about 2 years ago, a broken bar. The real trouble began with whispers, soft at first, but growing steadily louder. Henderson, it turned out, had been talking at home meetings. I only found out thanks to Mrs. Gable, a kind widow who lived on the edge of the development and appreciated the chorus of birds that frequented my land. She had a sharp ear and an even sharper sense of injustice. According to her, Henderson was planting the seeds of a grand plan: more guest parking. Willow Creek Estates had been built with narrow streets and undersized driveways, and now visitors often had nowhere to park. Henderson, ever the self-styled visionary, saw an opportunity to leave his mark a tidy, paved lot to solve the community's parking woes. But there was one issue: all the suitable whole land had already been landscaped or allocated for other uses. That's when his gazette cold, calculating settled on the one remaining open space: my lake, a private, spring-fed body of water that had nothing to do with the HOA. But to Henderson, it was just underutilized land. The first strike came in the form of a thick packet dropped in my mailbox. It was an engineering report commissioned by the HOA, and Henderson hailed it as gospel. The report, authored by a firm I'd never heard of, claimed that my peaceful, century-old lake posed a growing flood risk to the downhill properties of Willow Creek Estates. A flood risk? My lake? I laughed at first. The idea was absurd. My lake prevented flooding. It absorbed rain like a sponge and released it gradually through natural seepage. The very idea that it was a threat was laughable. But my amusement didn't last. Not after I reached the recommendations section. The lake, it claimed, should be drained and the land regraded for stormwater management, of course. And if that just so happened to make room for a spacious new parking lot, well, wasn't that a lucky coincidence? That's when it hit me. This wasn't about flood risk. It was a manufactured crisis. Henderson wanted my land, specifically, the Lakea, and he'd cooked up a safety issue to get it. He was betting on fear and bureaucracy. But he underestimated me. I'm a civil engineer. My specialty? Hydrology. This was my battlefield. I tore through their so-called expert report. It was sloppy and embarrassment. Really, rife with lazy assumptions, cherry-picked data, and laughable methodologies. It blamed increased runoff from development, yet failed to mention that my lake predated every house in Willow Creek Estates. For a century, it had done the very job they now claimed it couldn't. They even used grainy drone photos from a freak once-in-a-decade storm to prove the lake's high water mark of photos that showed nothing more than a slightly elevated shoreline. The irony? While warning that water had nowhere to go, they planned to destroy the very system that handled that water better than any man-made fix ever could. So, I got to work. I drafted a comprehensive rebuttal: historical rainfall data, geological records, topographical maps from as far back as 1912. I ran my own flood models, showing how my lake actually reduced peak runoff downstream. I showed how draining it would increase the very risks they claimed to fear. I detailed the ecosystem the lake supported: frogs, fish, birds, butterflies. I laid out how it helped recharge local aquifers and filtered pollutants naturally. I cited environmental protection codes and wetland preservation statutes the HOA was blatantly ignoring. I bound it all up in a thick dossier and presented it at the next HOA board meeting. Henderson sat at the head of the table, arms crossed, a smug smirk on his face. His mostly spineless sycophants avoided my gaze. When I finished speaking, he leaned forward and said, "Thank you for your input, Mr. Jenkins. We have our own experts, and they disagree. The safety of the community is our top priority." And just like that, he moved on to the next agenda item as if I'd just read the week's weather forecast. It was a brush off. Cold, dismissive, calculated. I knew then this wouldn't be one with logic or facts alone, so I lawyered up. Bill was a good attorney, seasoned in property disputes. He was honest, too, which I appreciated. "Arthur," he told me, "HOAs are tricky. They're CC or covenants, conditions, restrictions that can give them enormous leeway, especially if they convince themselves or a judge that public safety is involved." Even though the lake sat largely on my deeded land, Bill pointed out the HOA was arguing that its effects extended beyond my borders. They claimed that by existing, the lake posed a hazard to their community. "We can fight it," he said, "but it won't be cheap or quick." And the outcome? Uncertain. They've got a report. They've got a narrative. That gives them a head start. He was right, but I wasn't going to let that stop me. The HOA's report may have been flawed, but it was still authored by credentialed experts. To counter it in court, we'd need equally qualified professionals, an expensive and uphill battle, and even then, judges often deferred to HOAs when it came to community safety, unless we could prove malice or gross negligence, an almost impossible task when they were cloaking their intentions in the guise of due diligence. Meanwhile, Henderson was hard at work on the court of public opinion. He hosted what he called informational sessions, though Mrs. Gable described them as more like rants aloud proclamations about the imminent danger of my lake and the selfishness of one man holding the entire neighborhood hostage over a puddle. He painted me as some eccentric loner, indifferent to the needs of others. To sweeten his pitch, he unveiled glossy renderings of the so-called Henderson Plaza, the proposed parking lot, complete with landscaped medians, decorative lampposts, and even faux brick paving. He claimed it would increase property values and resolve all the neighborhood's long-standing parking issues. Some residents, especially those with frequent visitors or multiple vehicles, bought into it. Others were uneasy but didn't dare to challenge him publicly. Then came the inevitable. The HOA board, predictably loyal to Henderson, voted to move forward with the so-called lake remediation and community enhancement project. I received the formal notice by certified mail. In 30 days, work would begin to drain the lake and prepare the site for parking. The letter cited various clauses in the HOA's master plan regarding drainage control and the board's authority to act for the collective good. It was a declaration of war. The idea of industrial machines rolling in, ripping apart something so natural, so peaceful, to replace it with something so utilitarian and soul-deadening, it filled me with a cold, focused fury. They were really going to do it. They were going to kill my lake, and I knew, even with my lawyer scrambling to delay them with emergency filings, the wheels were already in motion. The first hearing wouldn't happen for another week, and by then, Henderson might already present the court with a fait accompli, a lake already drained, damage already done. The morning they arrived is forever etched into my memory. I awoke to the low rumble of heavy equipment, diesel engines coughing to life. Peering through the blinds, I saw the full arsenal: a hulking excavator, a bulldozer, flatbeds hauling industrial pumps, and enormous coils of thick black hose. They were staging on HOA common land, which bordered the edge of my lake, a land Henderson had cleverly labeled the official access point for remediation. And there was Henderson himself, of course, standing tall in a ridiculous yellow hard hat perched atop his golf shirt, waving and pointing like some budget version Napoleon as he barked directions to the work crew. I felt sick. My attorney had managed to file for an emergency injunction, but he warned me chances were slim, and time was not on our side. Henderson knew it. He was pushing full speed ahead, betting that a drained lake was something the courts couldn't undo. I walked out to the end of my small wooden dock and stood there, helpless, as the destruction began. The workers, to their credit, weren't malicious, just indifferent. It was just another job to them. They set up their pumps with clinical precision, hoses snaking into the clear, still water like invasive tentacles. Then, with a mechanical roar, the pumps kicked to life. My clean, beautiful lake began to vanish. The water gushed through the discharge hoses, funneled into a rough drainage ditch that led to the stormwater system far off in the distance. A system designed for runoff and not the draining of a 2-acre body of water. Slowly at first, then steadily, the waterline began to fall. I watched the muddy edges creep outward as the lake receded. Fish, trapped in shrinking puddles, thrashed in desperation. Herons and egrets circled above, their cries loud and unsettled, as if they sensed the wrongness of it all. It was a small-scale ecological disaster, orchestrated with stunning arrogance. I tried reasoning with the foreman, showed him my property lines, pointed out that a significant part of the lake was mine. He just shrugged and pointed to Henderson, now watching from the air-conditioned comfort of his Escalade. Talk to the boss, mate. I just follow orders. Henderson, of course, didn't even roll down the window. He just gave me that same smug grin. For 2 relentless days, the draining continued. The water dropped foot by foot, exposing the lakebed's forgotten contours of the sunken logs, the once hidden shallows, the mossy stones. It became a wide, muddy scar. The air stank of rot and decay. The small springs that had fed the lake for generations still trickled, creating feeble puddles. only to be sucked away by the waiting pumps. And then there was nothing, just silence, no more gentle waves, no more frogs, no more life, only absence. A void where beauty had once been, just a gaping, muddy wound remained where my lake once shimmered. Within a week before the injunction hearing, now rendered irrelevant, the bulldozers arrived. They began scraping away the rich, dark sediment, filling in the lake's deeper pockets with coarse gravel and bits of construction refuse. The majestic oaks and maples that had once framed the water, some with roots now exposed, others simply inconvenient to the new parking lot's blueprint, were felled without ceremony, their ancient trunks hauled off like garbage. I felt each chainsaw bite as though it were slicing into me. Then came the asphalt, hot, black, and unyielding, poured thick over the grave of what had once been my sanctuary. Steam rose from it in waves as machines flattened it into a uniform, soulless expanse. Finally, the striping crews came, painting precise white line as a rows of numbered spaces for cars, Henderson's holy grail. He even put up a sign, Willow Creek Estates Community Parking, A.G. Henderson, President. His monument to short-sightedness. The transformation from vibrant ecosystem to sterile blacktop was completed in less than a month. Henderson strutted around like a minor warlord basking in conquest. Some residents offered him praise, others, like Mrs. Gabley, just looked away in quiet regret. "I'm so sorry, Arthur." "It's a crime," she whispered when she passed me. And it was a crime against nature, committed under the banner of community improvement, driven by one man's ego and a board's blind obedience. Standing before the steaming pavement, staring at the place that once teemed with life, something inside me shifted. The despair that had weighed me down began to harden, solidifying into a cold, deliberate focus. They thought it was over. They thought they'd won, but they didn't understand water. Water doesn't forget. You can block it, reroute it, bury it under asphalt, but it remembers where it belongs. And Arthur Jenkins, civil engineer and hydrologist, was ready to remind it. The days that followed were gray and hollow. Each morning, I looked out my window at that obscene slab of pavement where water once danced in the sunlight. Henderson's white Escalade was always in the best spot, right near the sign, gleaming like a trophy. Sometimes he'd wave smug and satisfied. The HOA newsletter celebrated the project's completion, praising the enhanced amenities. I stopped reading after the first paragraph. I avoided my neighbors, avoided small talk. I withdrew into my home, into my office, and deeper into my thoughts. The anger never left, but now it had direction. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, though I won't pretend that the idea of wiping that smug look off Henderson's face wasn't a pleasant thought. No, this was about justice, about balance, about reminding these fools that nature isn't optional, that real science, can't be paved over with bureaucracy and bluster. Hydrology is often misunderstood. People think it's just rivers and dams, but it's so much more. It's rainfall, runoff, infiltration, it's groundwater flow and evapotranspiration. It's about how water moves through a system, both visible and unseen. That lake wasn't just scenery, it was the heart of a delicate hydrological network, a recharge zone for the shallow aquifer that lay beneath Willow Creek Estates. It acted like a sponge, soaking up rainfall, especially during storms, then gradually releasing it into the soil or into slow surface flow, by draining it and worse, paving it over with 2 acres of impermeable asphalt. Henderson hadn't just killed an ecosystem. He destabilized the entire water balance of the area. That vast blacktop was now a shield. Rain that once soaked peacefully into the ground now had nowhere to go, and water, obeying gravity as it always does, began seeking the next lowest point. Downhill, straight toward the bulk of the homes in Willow Creek, including Henderson's gleaming property. I dove into research. This wasn't about grief anymore, it was about precision. I pulled out the original topographical surveys I'd kept since buying my property, cross-referenced them with county records. The maps revealed everything: the natural contours, ancient drainage channels, gentle depressions carved by centuries of rain. My lake hadn't been incidental, it was the catch basin for a sprawling watershed. Without it, there was only one direction the water could go, and I knew exactly how to help it get there. The soil composition reports from before Willow Creek Estates was developed confirmed what I already suspected. mostly clay loam, not ideal for fast drainage. That made the lake's role as a natural reservoir even more vital. I pored over the HOA's original master drainage plan, the very one they were obligated to follow. Predictably, it had been structured around major existing water features, including specific allowances for runoff and seepage from the lake. But there was no backup plan for the lake simply vanishing. Next, I examined the as-built plans for the new parking lot, which I had acquired via Freedom of Information Act requests. Any major change to site drainage legally requires permits. The plans were slapdash. The grading was minimal, clearly meant to push water off the surface quickly. But where was that water supposed to go? Mostly toward the lot's lowest perimeter points, points that, unsurprisingly, sat directly uphill from several homes. It also drained toward the very storm sewers that had been overwhelmed when they pumped out my lake. Those drains were built for slow, steady street runoff and not for handling the sudden deluge from 2 acres of water-repelling asphalt. My breakthrough wasn't a light bulb moment but a slow, growing realization grounded in hard data. The destruction of the lake had triggered 2 critical changes. It halted the recharge of the local aquifer in that zone, and it concentrated surface runoff. The immediate lakebed area might see a slight drop in water table levels at first, but in the long term, especially during wet seasons, the water table in the downhill sections of Willow Creek Estates was bound to rise. Why? Because those areas had once relied on the lake to absorb in moderate excess groundwater. Now, they'd receive even more runoff, with no natural system left to regulate it. Residents who once enjoyed dry basements and crawl spaces thanks to the lake's sponge-like regulation were about to face a rude awakening. And as for the parking lot itself, laid atop what had been a saturated basin without deep drainage, that was going to become very interesting, very soon. That's when my idea took root. This wasn't about sabotage. I wasn't going to sneak around rerouting pipes or digging trenches in the dead of night. That was Henderson's style: blunt, foolish, short-sighted. My approach would be subtle, fully grounded in hydrology, and entirely above board. I still own my 5 acres. The HOA had bulldozed the portion of the lake that edged into what they claimed was a common area easement, but the vast majority of the lakebed now buried beneath their blacktop lay adjacent to my property. My plan? Legally manage the water on my land and the water that now poured off their asphalt directly toward Ida in a way that was both environmentally sound and scientifically unassailable. If those efforts happened to amplify the water problems Henderson had unknowingly created for himself and his backers, well, that would just be a highly predictable and entirely natural consequence. I began by examining the existing drainage contours on my property. Even without the lake, the land still remembered where the water wanted to go. Faint swells, shallow, ancient channels now buried under brush and leaves as it could be restored, cleared and subtly regraded, they could quietly and effectively direct flow. Interestingly, many of them sloped toward the lower-lying sections of Willow Creek Estate, places that were likely marshy before the lake evolved into a natural regulator. Then there was the southern edge of the parking lot, poorly graded. I calculated that a good portion of runoff now surged directly toward the boundary with my land. Before, that water would have emptied into the lake. Now, it was my responsibility. So I made a decision. I'd construct a network of rain gardens and bioswales along that southern boundary. These are eco-friendly landscaping features designed to catch, filter, and slowly absorb stormwater. They're both functional and beautiful, and unlike Henderson's eyesore of a Loda and, when designed correctly, incredibly effective at managing runoff. I would design mine to be exceptionally effective. They would intercept nearly all the water spilling from Henderson's little monument to arrogance. And if, during especially heavy rains, those systems were to overflow, well, water has to go somewhere. And I'd be ready. Through nothing more than careful observation of natural patterns, I'd simply help guide it back to where it had always wanted to go, by subtly following the natural contours of my land and perhaps making a few nearly imperceptible adjustments to the old, barely visible swells. I had simply given the water a preferred path. That wasn't sabotage, that was good land stewardship. I hadn't created the flood. Henderson had, when he drained the lake that once absorbed all this water. I was merely helping the runoff find its way now that the lake was gone. The elegance of the plan was its simplicity. I wasn't diverting water with pumps or illegal plumbing. I wasn't moving anything, just allowing gravity and time to do what they do best. Nature, once balanced by the lake, was now free to tip itself back in the direction it wanted to go, helped slightly by the changes Henderson himself had forced. For the first time in weeks, a real smile crept across my face. The game was on. I began executing my plan with the kind of care and patience that made it nearly invisible. No backhoes, no dump trucks, just a shovel, a wheelbarrow, and a deep knowledge of terrain. I started with the old, long-neglected swales on my property. Historical maps and first-hand observation had shown me they were natural drainage lines. I cleared out the debris, deepened them just a touch and nothing extremia, and shaped them with subtle slopes that encouraged water to move gently away from my home. Coincidentally, these reshaped channels happened to guide water toward the lowest parts of Willow Creek Estate, specifically toward Henderson's house and those of his most loyal HOA allies. Funny how the land just worked that way. Next, I added rain gardens and bioswales along the edge of my property where it met the newly paved parking lot. I chose plants known for their tolerance of wet conditions and their ability to soak up large amounts of water: sedges, irises, rushes, native shrubs with deep root systems. They were environmentally sound, visually appealing, and very effective. And while these features could easily handle your average summer shower, they were designed with limits that, in the face of a strong downpour or prolonged storm, would be overwhelmed by the runoff from Henderson's massive, impervious blacktop. When the rain came hard, and it always did in the spring and fall, the excess water would spill out, naturally, and follow the reconditioned swales paths of least resistance toward the low ground, toward Henderson. It was all completely within my rights. I was managing stormwater responsibly on my own land in response to the changing conditions created by the HOA's actions. To make it all official, I even installed a small, tasteful sign: Native Plant Rain Garden, managing stormwater naturally. I imagine Henderson saw it and rolled his eyes, dismissing me as some eco-nut digging around in the dirt. He had no idea that he was looking at the architect of his very own hydrological nightmare. The science behind it was undeniable. That paved-over lakebed no longer functioned as a retention basin or aquifer recharge zone. It was now a vast collector of rainwater, which it dumped in great volume into an already fragile drainage system. The surrounding soil, dense, clay-rich, and once kept in balance by the lake's regulating presence, was now forced to absorb more than it could manage. Think of it like a bathtub. The lake had been the drain. Henderson had plugged it and then named a fire hose the parking lot runoff into the basin. The tub was going to fill. It was going to overflow. My rain gardens weren't a flood, they were a filter, a sponge. But even the best sponge has its limits. The first signs came quietly, about 3 months after the parking lot was finished, right when the autumn rains returned. Mrs. Gable, my always-in-the-loop informant, casually mentioned that neighbors further down the slope had begun noticing a musty smell in their basements. One of Emma Peterson, a vocal Henderson supporter, found a small puddle forming in his basement workshop after a particularly heavy storm. He said it was a sump pump issue, something he'd never had in the 10 years he'd lived there. When asked, Henderson dismissed the reports. Isolated issues, he said. Poor maintenance. Oh, the irony. Thick enough to smear on toast. And the parking lot. It wasn't performing nearly as well as promised. After every good rain, large shallow pools lingered for days right over the deepest part of what used to be my lakebed, almost as if the ground itself remembered. The ground beneath the parking lot, it seemed, refused to forget. Mosquitoes once kept in check by the lake's fish began to breed enthusiastically in the stagnant puddles now scattered across Henderson's pavement. I also began hearing about them in the increasingly soggy lawns downhill. Then came the season's first major storm system. It wasn't a deluge, just a steady, soaking rain that lasted 3 days, and a kind of rain that reveals a landscape's true drainage abilities. I watched from my window, coffee in hand, as my rain gardens performed precisely as intended. The native plants stood proud and lush as the runoff from Henderson's engineering marvel sheeted off the asphalt, hit the edge of my property, and was largely absorbed at first. But by the second day, the gardens had reached their limit. Water began to quietly crest over the berms and spill into the swales, those reconditioned natural channels now clear and welcoming. Gravity took over from there, drawing the overflow away from my house and down the ancient, low-lying paths it had always followed. By the following week, the discontent in Willow Creek Estates was growing louder. Peterson's basement now had 3 inches of standing water, not just a puddle. Several other homeowners along the slope reported similar issues. Their lawns were waterlogged long after the skies cleared. On a drive-by, I noted with no small delight that Henderson's own pristine front yard had taken on a noticeable sponge-like texture. His prize-winning roses, once vibrant, were yellowing near the base. I even caught sight of him poking the turf with a garden fork, likely suspecting a broken sprinkler line. Still, he hadn't connected the dots. Blinded by his own perceived brilliance in solving a parking problem, Henderson couldn't see the much larger hydrological disaster he had orchestrated. The water, denied its ancestral resting place in my lake, was slowly but surely reclaiming its domain, or at the very least, making its presence known insistently, persistently in the lowest, soggiest corners of the neighborhood. Thanks to Henderson, aquatic equilibrium had begun a quiet, deliberate comeback. And then came spring. March was unusually wet, followed by those classic April cloudbursts that can saturate the ground in mere hours. By then, my rain gardens were thriving and the swales flowing freely. The massive, impermeable surface of Henderson's lot gathered every drop of rainfall, directing it efficiently toward my property. My system accepted what it could gracefully and passed the excess along just as gracefully. This time, the impact on Willow Creek Estates wasn't subtle. It was undeniable. Lawns turned into bogs. Sump pumps ran non-stop, then failed. Basements that had been dry for decades were now perpetually damp, with mold climbing the walls. The once musty odor Mrs. Gable mentioned had evolved into a pervasive, choking stench of mildew. Driveways cracked from shifting, waterlogged soil. One unfortunate soul, a particularly loud Henderson supporter, discovered that his entire backyard had transformed into a shallow, reeking pond teeming with frogs. The irony was delicious. Henderson's beloved parking lot didn't escape either. The minor puddling of autumn had matured into full-blown collapse. Entire sections of asphalt, especially those where the lake had once been deep, began to sink and crack. Water seeped up through the fractures, as though the very earth was revolting against its confinement. The once impressive expanse began to resemble a swamp at its edges. Parking spaces vanished under pools of standing water or devolved into muddy quagmires. His pristine white Escalade now regularly wore a trim of crusted mud along the tires and lower panels. He did not look pleased. According to Mrs. Gable, home meetings transformed from Henderson's smug monologues into frantic shouting matches. Residents demanded answers. So why were their properties turning into wetlands? Henderson, now pale and sweaty rather than rosy and self-assured, blamed unprecedented rainfall and old infrastructure. In desperation, he brought in a new engineering firm. A different team this time, likely not on his holiday card list. They began their poking and probing, trying to understand how a solution had turned into a slow-moving disaster. The new consultant wandered around, took soil samples, and looked deeply concerned. I, of course, played the part of the concerned but slightly baffled neighbor. When approached by anxious residents, I'd offer a sympathetic shake of the head and say, "It's really such a shame. What's happening?" Then, with a thoughtful pause, "I'm no expert in these things, of course, but it does make you wonder what happens when you drastically alter a natural water table." I gesture casually toward my thriving rain gardens. "I've tried to manage the runoff onto my property the best I can, but when you change the entire system, a broken bar." I'd let the sentence hang in the air, unresolved but suggestive. At home meetings, which I had resumed attending purely for the entertainment, I would occasionally chime in with what I made sure sounded like harmless curiosity. "Has anyone looked into whether removing the lake and compacting the land for the parking lot might have redirected groundwater flow, or increased hydrostatic pressure on lower foundations?" Hydrostatic pressure always landed with an appropriately grim weight. Henderson would glare at me, but he couldn't exactly silence a resident politely asking a question. Not in front of a room full of angry homeowners. Eventually, the consultants presented their findings to the HOA board. A disillusioned board member, once a Henderson supporter, now bitterly regretful, leaked me a copy of the report. It confirmed everything I had long suspected. The lake's removal and replacement with a vast, impermeable slab had wreaked havoc on the neighborhood's hydrology. The water table had risen several feet. Soil was saturated well beyond its capacity. The proposed solutions were a nightmare: extensive regrading of shared areas, a complex, costly network of French drains, new storm sewers. Worst of all, recommendations for individual homeowners to install expensive waterproofing systems, interior and exterior drainage upgrades, and multiple industrial-grade sump pumps on their own dime. The hose portion of the remediation bill ran into the hundreds of thousands, necessitating massive special assessments. Residents erupted in outrage. Henderson's once bulletproof leadership collapsed. I took special note that his own home was among the worst affected. His basement was a swamp, and his backyard now hosted a permanent water feature that stubbornly refused to be drained. The once prized rose garden was a patch of moldy stems. His Escalade wore a permanent coat of muck, no matter how often he cleaned it. At a particularly stormy emergency home meeting complete with screaming residents and soaked paperwork, Henderson finally cracked. Face pale, voice tight, he announced his resignation as HOA president, citing health reasons. The room didn't cheer so much as exhale one long, exhausted, angry sigh of catharsis. The aftermath was costly, chaotic, and deeply satisfying. The new, Chasen board secured a large loan to begin emergency drainage projects. Henderson's gleaming parking lot, once the proud centerpiece of his vision, became a cracked, half-flooded monument to hubris. Many spaces were unusable for months at a time. My property, on slightly higher ground and shielded by rain gardens and swales, remained perfectly dry. In fact, I began a new project, something to heal the scars left behind. Not a full lake yet too late for that, but a series of interconnected ponds and natural wetlands. A haven for birds, frogs, dragonflies. A touch of paradise, reborn. A living reminder to Willow Creek estates of what happens when water is respected instead of ignored. Some homes in the lowest zones never fully recovered. They sold at steep discounts, their new owners grimly aware of the permanent water issues. As for Henderson, I heard he sold his house for a pittance and moved out of state. Good riddance. They paved paradise and put up a parking lot. I just gently, methodically reminded them that nature always bats last. And sometimes it brings the swamp right back, especially when you're foolish enough to plug its drain. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in my shoes, or if your hoe has ever tried to pull a fast one. Because trust me, I know exactly how frustrating it is when someone thinks they know best, especially when they're completely, utterly wrong.